They said he glowed in the dark. Under the moonlight, his skin shimmered like something unholy, too pale for the living, too perfect for the flesh of man. When Master Jonathan Creed first saw him at the auction in Savannah, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Some laughed. Others whispered scripture. They called him the ghost of Dahomey. Creed, ever the collector of oddities, paid 10 times the asking price. He told his guests he was buying a curiosity, a conversation piece for his estate near the Georgia border. A boy so white he looked carved from candle wax. They said his eyes were pink like blood under glass. His name, if he ever had one, was taken from him. Creed named him Elias. From the first night, the servants swore they heard soft weeping from the slave quarters, followed by a whisper that wasn't in English. The dogs wouldn't go near his shack. When the preacher came for supper and tried to bless the food, the cross on the table cracked in two. The master's youngest daughter, Clara, began drawing strange symbols on her window with soot. When asked why, she said, "So he won't come inside when it's dark." Elias worked silently, always in shadow. His hands trembled when sunlight touched them. The overseer said his sweat smelled like copper. Within weeks, 2 slaves vanished. No bodies, just drag marks near the swamp and blood pooled where the ground refused to drink. Creed, obsessed with his purchase, began documenting Elias's behavior in a private journal, the one found decades later in a chest sealed with wax. The entries start as curiosity, but by autumn, they turn into confession. In the final line of the first entry, he wrote, "I bought him because he was beautiful, but beauty, I fear, is the devil's favorite disguise." When the first frost came to Creed Plantation, the family gathered inside for supper, but Elias remained outside, still and silent beneath the pecan tree. The housekeeper said she saw him watching the windows, his pale face reflected in the glass like a ghost begging to be let in. That same night, Clara Creed, the youngest daughter, began to speak in her sleep. Her words were not English, not even human, they said. Jonathan Creed's fascination had turned into obsession. He spent nights in his study, recording the boy's habits in a thick leather journal. He wrote about the way Elias never blinked, how his shadow never matched the angle of the sun. The more he wrote, the stranger the plantation became. Chickens refused to lay eggs. The well water turned cloudy. The walls began to hum softly after dusk, a sound no one could trace. Clara's drawings grew darker. She sketched Elias standing behind her bed, his face stretched into something that smiled wrong. The family doctor burned the drawings, but she simply drew more, always with ash and always the same words underneath. "He is learning our faces." The overseer tried to whip Elias one morning for refusing to speak, but the whip never touched him. It split midair, fraying like old rope. The man's hand blistered as if burned. He quit that night and fled toward Savannah, muttering about the white ghost in the field. Creed's wife, Margaret, begged her husband to sell the boy. But Creed refused. "He's not a boy," he said. "He's a mirror. He shows us what we are." By December, servants reported seeing 2 figures moving in the field when only one had been sent to work. And every morning Creed found his journal open, to pages he swore he had not written. The ink glistened wet. The handwriting was not his. In one entry, scrawled in trembling script, it read, "You did not buy me. You invited me." They would later call it the Night of the 2 Moons, though only one hung in the sky. The other was seen reflected in the swamp water, red and trembling, as if the heavens had bled into the earth. That night, nothing on Creed Plantation obeyed its natural order. The roosters crowed at midnight. The cows stood facing the woods motionless, and the air, heavy and metallic, carried the smell of rain that never came. Inside the mansion, Clara refused to eat. Her skin had turned pale as bone, and she whispered that she could see the boy through the walls, not walking but floating, his bare feet never touching the floorboards. Margaret Creed clutched a Bible until her knuckles split, praying through clenched teeth. But even her prayers began to twist. words bending like candle wax in heat. Jonathan Creed sat alone in his study, staring at the journal that had begun writing itself. Lines appeared in the dark, one after another, as if an unseen hand dragged across the page. The words said, "When the two moons meet, your house will be hollow." He tore the page out, but the writing bled through to the next. By dawn, the whole book was filled. Every line, every inch inked in that same alien script. The slaves huddled together in the quarters, terrified. One woman swore she saw Elias kneeling by the well, whispering into it as though speaking to something deep below. The sound echoed like a voice answering back. By morning, the well water had turned the color of rust, and all the fish in the nearby stream floated belly up. When Jonathan Creed confronted Elias, the boy simply looked at him, eyes pink and endless. "You shouldn't have written my name," Elias said softly. "Now it remembers you." That night, the reflection of the red moon in the swamp pulsed like a heartbeat, and the Creed house began to breathe. By the first week of January, the house had begun to change. Servants whispered that it was breathing. Doors exhaled warm air when opened. Curtains swelled inward, though no wind passed. The walls, once solid oak, seemed to pulse faintly, as if something beneath the plaster strained to get out. Every night the sound grew louder, a wet, rhythmic sigh in time with the heartbeat of someone unseen. Margaret Creed was the first to lose her mind. She claimed she heard children laughing behind the wallpaper, though the Creeds had only one child left. The laughter turned to crying, then to whispers begging to be let free. One morning she tore at the parlor wall with her fingernails until they broke and bled. Behind the plaster she found nothing, and only red clay, wet and warm as flesh. Jonathan Creed tried to rationalize it. He said the foundation was settling, the wood expanding in the humidity. But he knew better. He'd begun hearing his own voice echoing back from empty rooms, reciting the same lines from his journal he hadn't written himself. When he burned the book, the ashes formed letters on the hearth, rearranging to spell a single name: Elias. Clara stopped speaking entirely. She only stared, her eyes glassy and hollow. At night she scratched patterns into the floorboards, spirals and circles intersecting like eyes upon eyes. She didn't remember doing it, but her hands were always raw come morning. The slaves prayed in secret, but one by one they began to vanish again. Their cabin stood open, beds still warm, the ground outside marked by handprints leading into the soil. The dogs refused to bark. On the seventh night, Creed woke to find the walls pulsing, visibly now, with veins dark as ink snaking across the plaster. From deep within the house came a whisper, low and wet, that said, "We remember." That's when the portraits on the hallway walls began to weep, thick red tears that never dried. The sound began as a low vibration, a hum deep beneath the floorboards, like someone whispering through wood. At first, Creed thought it was the pipes or the wind, but it carried syllables soft and deliberate. When he pressed his ear to the parlor floor, he could hear them clearly, dozens of voices murmuring his name. By morning, the air smelled of iron and mildew. Dust fell from the rafters, and the humming grew louder, rising from beneath the foundation as if the earth itself were speaking. The slaves refused to enter the main house. They said the ground had gone hollow, that something was moving beneath it. Jonathan Creed ordered a group of men to dig near the cellar, convinced rats or water had eroded the base. What they found was neither. 2 feet below the bricks they uncovered wood, not from the house but from coffins. Dozens of them, small and rotted, packed into the soil like a hidden graveyard. Each lid carved with strange looping symbols that no one could read. The stench was unbearable, thick and sweet like spoiled fruit. When one of the men pried open a coffin, he screamed. Inside wasn't bone. It was skin, stretched tight over black mud, as if something had grown from the flesh itself. The others fled. Only Creed remained, staring into that open box, his candle flickering as the voices below rose into song. That night the sound returned, louder, echoing through every wall. Clara woke from her sleep and said softly, "They're not buried. They're feeding." Her voice wasn't hers, it was older, rougher, speaking through her mouth. When Creed rushed to her side, the candlelight caught movement in the floorboards. The wood rippled. Hands, pale, thin, and trembling, pushed up through the cracks, reaching for the air. Elias stood in the doorway watching, his eyes reflecting the flame. "You dug too deep," he whispered. "You heard what was meant to stay dreaming." The walls exhaled again, long and wet, as if the house itself sighed in satisfaction. By the next dawn, Creed Plantation was no longer silent. The entire structure groaned and flexed, the wood moaning like a living body trying to stretch. Windows sweated a thin film of condensation even in the dead of winter. The mirrors warped, bending light into shapes that didn't belong. Jonathan Creed hadn't slept in days. He locked himself in his study, muttering that he could hear them breathing through the nails. He filled page after page in a new journal, though the handwriting no longer looked like his own. Between the lines of ink, words appeared in a faint red script, a second voice writing over his. Down in the cellar, the air pulsed. The coffins they had unearthed were gone. The hole they'd dug was filled again as though the earth had swallowed its secret back. But the smell lingered, copper and decay, so thick it clung to the tongue. Margaret Creed spent her days on her knees, praying until her lips bled. But each prayer ended with laughter, her own voice echoing back at her in a tone that wasn't hers. She began whispering to the walls, promising them things if they'd give her daughter back, and Clara, pale, silent Clara, had started drawing again. Only now she didn't use charcoal. She used her fingernails, carving faces into the wood of her bedpost. Each one identical, each one smiling like Elias. When Jonathan finally confronted the boy, he found him in the field, barefoot and still, the fog curling around him like smoke. "What are you?" Creed demanded. Elias turned his head slowly, eyes catching the dim light like wet pearls. "I'm what you made when you tried to own the strange," he said, "and now it owns you." As the sun broke over the horizon, the ground trembled. The air filled with the sound of hundreds of tiny gasps, as if every buried mouth beneath the plantation had just taken its first breath. The things that had slept beneath Creed's land were awake again. And they remembered their master's name. Clara Creed's eyes were no longer her own. The blue had drained from them, replaced by a soft, milky haze, the same translucent pallor that gleamed in Elias's. When the light struck her irises, it passed through instead of reflecting. Jonathan tried to convince himself it was illness, but deep down he knew what he was seeing. Inheritance. She no longer responded to her name. She walked the halls barefoot, her dress dragging like a ghost's shroud. Servants swore she could see through walls, her gaze following them even from the next room. Sometimes they'd find her standing before a mirror, whispering as though someone inside was whispering back. Margaret watched her daughter unravel with a silent, paralyzed grief. She would sit outside Clara's room, listening to the rhythmic scratching of nails against wood, a slow, patient sound that seemed to echo from inside the walls themselves. When she finally dared to open the door one night, she found the room covered in drawings. Hundreds of them. Faces with hollow eyes, all smiling the same way. At the center of the wall, Clara had written a single phrase over and over. "He is in the reflection." Jonathan tore the mirrors from every wall, shattered them, buried the shards in the field. But when he looked into a bucket of water, he saw Elias standing behind him, smiling with those glassy pink eyes. That night, the whispers beneath the floor returned. But this time they spoke through Clara. Her mouth moved, the words spilling out in two voices at once, hers and another, older, deeper. "He is not a slave," the voices said. "He is the memory of what you buried." Then her eyes rolled white, and every candle in the house went out at once. Darkness swallowed the room whole. When the flames returned, Elias was standing in the doorway again, but this time, there was no shadow beneath his feet. It happened on a windless night. The air heavy, the silence too perfect to be natural. Even the cicadas had gone still. Jonathan Creed sat in his study, trembling as he read the latest entries in his journal. He no longer remembered writing them, yet the ink was fresh, the words written in his own hand. She will open the door between what breathes and what remembers. Clara had not slept for 3 days. Her mother kept vigil outside her door, praying, weeping, her rosary beads snapping one by one like brittle bones. Then around midnight the doorknob turned by itself. Inside, Clara was standing in the center of the room, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The walls pulsed with light. A pale, living luminescence like something beneath the paint was alive. She spoke, though her lips barely moved. "The land remembers," she said in a whisper that carried through the house. Every drop, every name, every scream that sank into the dirt. "They never left." Her voice deepened, splitting into layers, a child's tone and another vast and ancient. "You built your house on the dead, Jonathan Creed, and now the dead want their home back." Margaret fell to her knees, sobbing, pleading for mercy. But Clara's gaze was fixed on her father. Elias appeared behind her, his face calm, his hands clasped in front of him like a preacher at a sermon. "You called me your curiosity," he said softly. "You forgot what curiosity costs." Then Clara's body arched, her limbs twisting unnaturally as her mouth opened wider than it should. A black mist poured out, thick, alive, humming like bees inside a coffin. The sound of voices rose within it, thousands speaking as one. The chandeliers shook. The house groaned. The windows blew open and every candle erupted into blue flame. When it ended, Clara collapsed to the floor. But the thing inside her, the thing that spoke through her, had not left. It was only waiting for the next breath. The mist did not vanish. It lingered low and heavy, seeping from the corners of the room like breath from the lungs of something buried alive. It clung to the walls, shimmered faintly, and moved with intention. When Jonathan reached out to touch it, it recoiled, not like smoke, but like muscle. Margaret screamed when the mist began to drip upward, collecting near the ceiling in slow, pulsing waves. Within it, faint outlines appeared, faces pressed against an invisible barrier, mouths open in silent screams. The house moaned as the floorboards buckled beneath the weight of what had been awakened. Elias stood perfectly still in the doorway, his eyes aglow in the blue light. "They've waited a long time to breathe again," he said softly, almost reverently. "You fed them with chains, with silence, with denial. Now they'll feed on remembrance." Jonathan tried to drag Clara from the room, but she would not move. Her eyes were open, fixed on the mist. "They know me," she whispered. "They've always known me." Her voice was full of both awe and terror. "They say I opened the door." The black haze coiled around her body like a lover's embrace. The air thickened until breathing felt like drowning. Servants fled, stumbling down the stairs as the candles flickered to life in unnatural hues. Green, violet, and a deep red that pulsed with rhythm. Outside, thunder rolled without lightning. The fields bent as though pressed from above, crops flattening in spirals. The dogs howled, then went silent. Jonathan turned to Elias, shouting, "What are you?" The boy tilted his head and his pale lips curved into something not human. "I'm not what you bought, Jonathan Creed. I'm what your kind made when you refused to remember." Then the mist rushed forward, filling the hallway, swallowing everything in its path. The screams that followed did not sound human. They sounded like the earth itself remembering how to grieve. By dawn, the Creed mansion was silent. Smoke drifted from the chimney, though no fire burned within. The once white walls were streaked with black residue that pulsed faintly, as if something beneath the surface still lived. Every clock had stopped at 3:17 a.m., the hour the mist had consumed the house. The servants who fled in the night gathered at the edge of the field, too afraid to return. They swore the house was breathing, the shutters expanding and contracting like ribs. From a distance, the windows looked like eyes, open, watching weeping condensation that glimmered pink in the morning sun. Jonathan Creed emerged at last, staggering through the doorway. His clothes were torn, his face smeared with soot and blood. He said nothing. His eyes were empty, not blank but hollow, as if something had been scooped out behind them. When he spoke, his voice was a whisper of several tones at once. "They're still here," he said. "The walls remember their names." Margaret was nowhere to be found. Clara was seen at the upstairs window, standing perfectly still, her hand pressed to the glass. Her skin had turned translucent, veins glowing faintly beneath it like river maps. The reflection behind her was not her own. By evening, the house began to hum again. A deep vibration shook the floors, and dust rose from the seams between the boards. The voices returned, hundreds, layered and low. They spoke in tongues lost to time, in rhythms that matched the beating of a human heart. Elias appeared once more on the porch, calm and expressionless. "Every house remembers what was buried beneath it," he said. "Yours just remembers louder." Then he stepped down into the field, and the ground rippled beneath his feet as though welcoming him home. The earth sighed and long, satisfied and warm, and the front door of the Creed mansion closed by itself with a sound that echoed like a coffin lid sealing shut. 3 days passed before anyone dared approach the mansion again. When they did, they found the front steps covered in fine gray ash. Not dust, not soot, but ash that shimmered faintly when touched by sunlight. It was warm, as though newly burned. The footprints leading to the door were deep and singular, like someone had walked barefoot through bone. Inside, the air was thick and unmoving. Every mirror in the house had cracked from the inside out. The parlor piano, untouched for years, was playing softly on its own, a slow, discordant melody that repeated endlessly, its keys pressing down without fingers. Jonathan Creed was found in the study, sitting upright at his desk. His eyes were open, his hands resting on the journal that had somehow rewritten itself yet again. The ink was no longer black but red, and every page carried the same phrase: "We are the choir beneath the ground." The men who entered swore they heard singing, faint, distant, and layered. 100 voices humming through the walls in a rhythm too slow for human lungs. The melody seeped from the floors, rising like steam. It sounded mournful at first, then pleading. When one of the men tried to lift Creed from his chair, the body crumbled. Not into decay, into ash, the same fine gray that covered the steps outside. His clothes fell empty, and from the heap rose a low hum that vibrated the very air. In the upstairs hallway, Clara was gone. Only her drawings remained, now etched into the plaster itself. The faces she'd carved had changed. They were no longer identical. Each bore the features of the vanished slaves, the missing servants, and finally her parents. At dusk, the piano music stopped. The humming deepened into a single resonant tone that shook the windows. Outside, the birds scattered. The trees bent away from the house. Then from somewhere deep below the floor, a new voice joined the choir, and soft, high, and unmistakably that of a child. By the 4th morning, the earth behind the Creed mansion had begun to change. The once flat plantation fields, long stripped and barren, were rising in uneven mounds, as though the soil itself was breathing beneath the dawn light. From afar, it looked like the land had grown a spine. The first man who dared step into the field never made it back. The others said they saw him stop suddenly, stare at the ground, and begin to laugh. A deep, choking laugh that turned to screams. When they reached the spot where he'd stood, there was no trace of him. Only the dirt, still warm, shifting as though something beneath it had swallowed him whole. That night, fog rolled in from the swamp, thick and pale. It clung low to the ground, glowing faintly, carrying the faint smell of smoke and iron. As it passed over the mounds, the earth began to settle, and then the faces appeared, hundreds of them, pressed into the soil like impressions in wax. Their eyes closed, their mouths slightly open, each one distinct and lifelike. Some bore scars. Others looked peaceful as if dreaming. The wind blew, and for a moment the air filled with a low moaning. Hundreds of voices humming the same mournful tone. The townsfolk called it a curse. But the old ones, the ones who still remembered the stories whispered on the coast, said it was something older, a reckoning of the buried. That night Elias stood among the faces, barefoot, silent, his head bowed as if in prayer. When lightning flashed, the townsman swore his reflection appeared in every set of eyes at once. By morning the mounds were gone. The field was flat again, but the soil was pale, almost white, as though it had absorbed the flesh of what once lay beneath. And when the sun rose high enough, the light caught something buried shallow under the dirt, rows of teeth, hundreds of them, all smiling. When the news of Creed Plantation's undoing reached the nearby parish, Reverend Silas Greer was the first to answer the call. He had baptized the Creed family years before, back when their name still carried respect, before whispers of hauntings and the pale boy from Savannah began to spread. He rode out at dawn, Bible in hand, muttering prayers into the fog. What he found was not the house he remembered. The once grand estate stood blackened, its windows sagging like open wounds. The fields surrounding it were chalk white, barren yet somehow glistening, as if the land had been salted with bone dust. Even the air smelled wrong, not of rot, but of something sweet and spoiled, like fruit left too long in the sun. He called out, but no one answered. The only sound was a soft, steady hum coming from the earth beneath his boots. The Reverend knelt, pressed his hand to the ground, and felt it vibrate faintly, a rhythm like a heartbeat. Inside, the air was colder. Hymn books lay scattered on the floor, pages fused together by damp. The piano sat open, its keys blackened, though no fire had touched it. And carved into the wall above the mantel were words etched deep by a trembling hand. The preacher blessed the wrong child. Greer froze. He had no memory of baptizing any child on the plantation, yet something in his chest tightened with guilt. He stepped farther in, his candlelight shaking across the ruined hall, until it fell upon movement at the far end of the corridor. A small figure stood there, barefoot, skin pale as moonlight. "Do you remember me, Reverend?" the boy asked softly. "You poured your water over me and called it salvation." Elias smiled then, and every candle in the house flared at once, brilliant, white and blinding. When Greer's sight returned, he was kneeling in the field again, his Bible charred to ash in his hands. The house behind him was gone. Only the singing remained. For 3 nights after the preacher's disappearance, the people of Lowndes County could hear singing carried through the pine trees. It came from the direction of the Creed property, a slow, sorrowful hymn with no discernible words, only long breaths rising and falling in perfect harmony. It never stopped. Day or night the melody wove through the wind like something half alive. At first the townsfolk thought it was the wind itself, but the notes were too deliberate, too human. Those who dared ride close to the property line said the sound vibrated in their bones, soft at first, then growing until their teeth ached. One man described it as the land trying to remember how to pray. By the second night, animals refused to graze near the plantation. Birds avoided the sky above it. The air shimmered faintly like heat mirage even in the cool of evening, and though the house was gone, a shape remained, bow an outline in the mist, faint but undeniable, as though the structure had burned its ghost into the very air. Then came the children. They said they saw a man in white standing by the old pecan tree at dusk. He would hum softly, beckoning with one hand. When asked who he was, they all said the same thing. He sings the song of the ones below. The sheriff gathered 6 men to investigate. None returned. On the 4th morning, their horses wandered home alone, eyes wide, mouths foaming, hooves coated in pale mud that smelled faintly of blood and smoke. By then, the hymn had changed. It was no longer mournful, It was triumphant, loud, and between its notes, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of weeping. That was when the elders declared the land forsaken. They nailed crosses to the trees, salted the roads, and forbade anyone from speaking the creed name aloud. But at night, the song continued, growing sweeter, fuller, as if the earth itself was learning the tune. They drew the salt line at the edge of the old road, a thick, unbroken ring encircling what had once been Creed Plantation. The elders said it would keep the voices in, though no one knew exactly what "in" meant anymore. The ground within that circle was different, pale, cracked, and humming faintly underfoot. No grass grew there, no insect dared crawl across it. Even the wind changed as it passed over, as if holding its breath. At first the barrier seemed to work. The singing faded to a distant hum, barely audible beyond the tree line. People began to believe the curse had finally settled, buried beneath prayer and salt. But hope in those days was fragile. On the third night, the sheriff's widow, who had lost her husband in the search party, was found standing at the salt line barefoot, her nightgown soaked as if she'd walked through rain. Her eyes were open, glassy, and fixed on the fields. When asked what she was doing, she said, "They're calling for me. They're lonely." Then she stepped across. By dawn, only her rosary remained, half buried in the white soil. The others tried to strengthen the barrier. They poured more salt, prayed louder, lit candles that burned without flame. But the ground grew restless again. Cracks spread through the white earth, releasing faint whispers that sounded like sighs. One by one the candles dimmed. Not from wind, but from something unseen drawing the air from their wicks. The preacher's bell, long rusted, began to toll by itself. Each strike echoed from beneath the soil rather than the steeple. And when they peered into the fields at dusk, they could see faint lights moving across the ground. Dozens of them, soft and flickering like lanterns searching for the way home. By week's end, the salt line had turned pink. The elder said it was rust, but the dogs refused to go near it, and the smell that rose from the ground was unmistakable. It was blood. By the first frost, the lanterns no longer flickered at random. They moved with rhythm, like mourners in a silent procession. From the edge of the salt line, people swore they saw figures holding them, tall shapes impossibly thin, draped in something white that shimmered faintly in moonlight. They walked the same path each night, from the ruins of the main house to the pecan tree, then back again, a ritual with no end, as if retracing some ancient sorrow. Those who watched too long said the lights began to whisper. Not words at first, but breaths, then names, always the names of the living. Children cried in their sleep, saying they'd dreamed of a pale man knocking softly on their window, offering a candle, saying, "Carry it for me," just until dawn. By morning, the dreams left behind real wax stains on their sheets. The town grew desperate. No church bell rang. No sermon dared mention the creed name. But fear is its own contagion, and silence only fed it. Rumors spread that the albino slave had not been born of flesh but of omen, that his skin was salt itself, the first warning of what lay buried beneath the plantation long before men arrived to claim it. When winter deepened, the lanterns multiplied. From the hills, they looked like a river of light flowing across the black fields. Some swore they heard the hymn again, slower this time, deeper, as though sung from underground. Then came the footprints. After a heavy snow, the town awoke to find hundreds of them leading from the Creed property toward the town square. Long, narrow, bare feet pressed deep into the white crust. They stopped just short of the church steps. There was no one there, only a single burning lantern, its glass smeared from the inside, as if something had clawed to get out. And beneath it, written in ash, a single word, return. It began with the smell, sharp and metallic like iron left too long in the rain. By dawn, the air over Lowndes County was thick with it. The townspeople said it came from the Creed property again, though no one dared go near the salt line anymore. The lanterns had stopped moving. They just burned, hundreds of them, motionless across the fields like sentinels marking a graveyard no one could see. Then, the church bell rang. No one had touched it in months. It tolled once, then again, then 13 times. The last note did not fade. It hung in the air, trembling as if waiting for an answer. When it came, it wasn't from the steeple. It was from beneath the earth. The ground outside the church rippled. Cracks formed between the cobblestones, narrow at first, then wide enough to see what lay beneath. Pale soil streaked red, and something glistening beneath it, pulsing like breath. The Reverend's daughter, who had not spoken since her father vanished, began to hum, softly at first, the same tune as the hymn that once haunted the fields. Her mother tried to silence her, but the girl's mouth kept moving, the sound growing, shaping words that weren't hers. "They are not gone," she said. "They're underneath." Then every lantern across the plantation went out at once. Total silence. Even the insects stopped. For one perfect, impossible moment, the world held its breath. Then came the noise. A deep, wet groan that shook windows and loosened nails from beams. The snow outside turned pink. From the distance, shapes began to move. Not walking, not crawling, but rising. The figures in white were coming back, dragging something behind them. What looked like ropes but moved like veins. The salt line cracked open. The pink turned to red, and through the breach stepped a man with skin the color of bone dust and eyes that reflected no light. He smiled, the kind of smile made for no living face, and whispered, "I have returned." The salt cracked like thunder. A blinding light burst upward from the ground, then collapsed into shadow so deep it swallowed the moon. The wind reversed, pulling inward toward the old plantation, carrying with it the scent of decay and something older, something sweet, like spoiled honey and burnt myrrh. Those who witnessed it said time seemed to bend. The trees bowed toward the center of the field. The lanterns, once extinguished, flared alive again, not with fire but with faces. Each flame revealed a visage frozen mid-scream, flickering in agony. The shapes in white no longer wandered. They knelt as though in worship, surrounding the man of bone-pale skin. The ground beneath him pulsed alive, as if the soil itself recognized him. With each pulse the salt circle disintegrated more, turning from solid white crystals to fine, red dust. By the third pulse the barrier was gone. A roar filled the valley, half wind, half human, and in its wake came the memories the town had buried. People fell to their knees, clutching their heads, reliving visions not their own. The crack of the whip, the wail of children, the smell of burning flesh. Centuries of cruelty pressed deep into the soil began to rise like steam. From within that steam the man spoke, not in English, not in any tongue known to men, but every ear understood him. His voice sounded like earth being turned by shovel, like the first breath of something unburied. "You built your comfort upon their bones," he said. "Now your bones shall speak." The church bell shattered. Every mirror in town split down the middle. The air thickened until it vibrated, humming like the low moan of the earth itself. The people of Lowndes tried to flee, but found every road turned back on itself. The land had sealed them in. That night, the last entry in the parish ledger was written in an unsteady hand. "The salt has broken." The field remembers the storm began without thunder. The sky did not darken, it bled. Clouds turned the color of rust, and a fine mist of red rain drifted over Lowndes County, settling on rooftops, skin, and soil alike. Where it touched, the earth hissed as if scalded. By midnight, the town was silent. No dogs barked. No birds flew. The streets shimmered faintly, reflecting shapes that weren't there. Silhouettes of people moving backward, whispering prayers no human tongue had ever learned. Every window pane pulsed with light from unseen flames. Then came the voices. At first they rose like wind through the cane fields, low, rhythmic, thousands murmuring at once. But as the sound grew, so did its meaning. They were reciting names. Not of the living but of the forgotten. Every name buried, erased, or sold for coin was now spoken aloud, one after another, until the air itself trembled with grief. From the center of the plantation, the pale man raised his hand. The lanterns lifted from the ground, circling him like fireflies around a corpse. His eyes burned red, and not from rage, but from remembrance. Behind him the soil cracked open, revealing what the earth had hidden for a century. Hundreds of bones polished smooth, glowing faintly as though remembering the sun. The people who witnessed it said the ground began to breathe, expanding, contracting until the graves no longer held still. Hands of salt-white flesh reached upward, clawing toward the sky, their mouths open in perfect silence. Some said they were not vengeful, only awake, that they sought not blood but acknowledgement. But the living could not bear the sight. They screamed, they ran, and they were swallowed by the mist that rose from the ground. When morning came, the fields were empty. No bones, no lanterns, only footprints, thousands of them, leading toward the horizon. And carved into the door of the ruined church was a single phrase: "Memory does not forgive." By sunrise, the world had gone still. The air over Lowndes County hung thick and unmoving, as if even time refused to step forward. The red rain had dried into a fine dust, coating every surface in a dull, pink shimmer, the residue of something ancient, something not of heaven or hell, but older than both. The few who survived the night spoke in whispers for the rest of their days. They said the dawn light over the Creed fields looked wrong, too bright, too clean, as if it were trying to cover what the darkness had confessed. But no bird sang that morning. The earth, having remembered, demanded quiet. When the first outsiders arrived weeks later, they found the town deserted. Doors hung open, meals rotted on tables, and the church bell lay split in half on the ground, blackened by heat from no known fire. Of the people, there was no sign, only a trail of salt leading from the graveyard down toward the fields, where it ended abruptly as though erased by a wave. The soil there was pale as bone, smooth and cold to the touch. Some said it felt like skin. The investigators cataloged everything: the cracked earth, the half-buried rosaries, the strange hum that lingered beneath their boots. Yet none could explain the faint vibration that persisted in the air, or why, if one stood still long enough, the rhythm matched that of a human heartbeat. One of them, a geologist from Atlanta, spent hours listening. Before leaving, he wrote a single line in his field journal: "The ground is not dead. It only sleeps." No one returned to Lowndes County after that. Maps quietly omitted its borders, records dissolved into rumor, and the name Creed Plantation passed from memory. But sometimes when the wind blows from the south, old farmers still claim to hear a faint hymn beneath the rustle of the fields. A low, sorrowful song that never ends. They say it isn't haunting, it's remembering. And remembrance, once awakened, is a silence that never truly fades.